The telegram arrived on an April morning in 1885, carried by a boy who could not meet her eyes. Lenora Hartwell stood in the doorway of the small house she shared with her husband in the Willamette Valley, watching the boy's retreating back as he hurried down the muddy path toward the road. She did not need to open the envelope to know what it contained. She had felt something break inside her chest at dawn, a sudden coldness that had nothing to do with the spring chill, and she had known even then that Silas was gone. The words confirmed what her heart already understood. Logging accident. Douglas fir. Died at the scene. The company extends its condolences. She read the telegram 3 times, standing perfectly still in the doorway while the morning light shifted around her. Then she folded the paper with careful precision, or tucked it into her apron pocket, and walked to the kitchen to finish kneading the bread she had started before the knock came. The dough was still rising when the foreman arrived that afternoon. He was a thick-necked man named Walters who smelled of pine sap and discomfort. He stood in her parlor with his hat crushed between his hands, unable to look at the photographs on the mantel that showed Silas laughing, Silas holding a fishing rod, Silas standing beside Lenora on their wedding day with an expression of such pure joy that it hurt to witness even in 2 dimensions. "The tree came down wrong," Walter said, his voice rough with something that might have been guilt or might have been the lingering effects of whatever he had drunk to fortify himself for this visit. "We did everything by the book, Mrs. Hartwell. Sometimes the forest just decides to take someone." Lenora nodded. She had been married to a logger for 19 years. She understood the mathematics of the profession, the way the odds accumulated with each falling tree until they became a certainty rather than a risk. "He was alive for a few minutes after," Walters continued. "He asked me to tell you something." Lenora waited. "He said to forgive the tree." Walters shook his head, clearly baffled by the message. "He said the tree did not know what it was doing, and you would understand." She did understand. Silas had spent his life among the great forests of Oregon, felling trees that had stood for centuries, and he had never lost his sense of wonder at their majesty or his respect for their power. To die beneath one of them was, in his way of thinking, simply the cost of the bargain he had struck with the wilderness. The company sent $200 in an envelope that arrived a week later. Conscience money delivered by the same foreman, with the same expression of mingled guilt and hope that she would not make trouble. Lenora accepted it without comment. She had no intention of making trouble. She had no intention of doing anything except surviving, which was the only revenge that mattered against a universe that had taken her husband and left her with nothing but memories and a modest sum that represented his entire working life reduced to paper currency. She was 43 years old. She had no children, no family within 1,000 miles, and no clear idea of what to do next. But Lenora Hartwell was not a woman who succumbed to despair. She was the daughter of Maud Hartwell, who had been the daughter of a woman whose name was spoken with reverence in the hill country of Tennessee, and the women of her line had survived wars and famines and the long journey west with nothing but their knowledge and their stubborn refusal to surrender. She spread a map across her kitchen table and studied it by lamplight, looking for something she could not quite name, a place where she could rebuild, a place where the skills her mother had taught her might matter, a place where the abundance that others overlooked might become the foundation of a new life. Her finger stopped on a small dot in the foothills of the Cascade Range, Elkridge, Oregon, population 260. The surrounding area was marked with the symbols for orchards and wild fruit, but the town itself was described in the marginal notes as primarily a logging and mining community with limited agricultural development. Lenora smiled for the first time since the telegram arrived. Limited agricultural development meant that no one was paying attention to the fruit, and in her experience, fruit that no one paid attention to was fruit that rotted on the ground while people complained about the cost of provisions. She sold the house in the Willamette Valley for $60, packed her belongings into a wagon, and headed east toward the mountains with her sorrel mare Copper pulling steadily through the spring mud. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her now except grief, and grief was a weight she intended to transform into something useful. The journey took 11 days. She traveled alone, camping beside the road at night, cooking simple meals over small fires, speaking to no one except Copper, who listened with the patient understanding that horses reserve for humans who treat them kindly. By the time she crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley where Elkridge huddled against the base of the mountains, she had already decided where she would build. The eastern hillside caught her eye immediately. It faced the morning sun, which meant maximum light during the crucial drying hours. The afternoon breeze swept across it reliably, which meant consistent airflow for moisture removal. The slope was too steep for farming or grazing, which meant the land would be cheap, and scattered across the surrounding hills, visible even from this distance, were the dark masses of wild plum thickets. In the silver-gray tangle of abandoned apple orchards, and the deep green of huckleberry meadows that no one had bothered to harvest. She descended into the valley with a sense of purpose she had not felt since Silas died. The land cost $30 for 5 acres. The seller was a mining speculator named Hendricks who had bought the hillside years ago, hoping to find silver, and had found nothing but rock and disappointment. He accepted Lenora's money with the expression of a man who believes he has successfully cheated a foolish widow, and Lenora accepted the deed with the expression of a woman who knows exactly what she is buying and why. She built the drying shed first. This decision would later be cited as evidence of her madness. But Lenora understood something that the people of Elkridge did not. A cabin could be built in winter if necessary. Food preservation could not wait. The summer fruit was already ripening on the hillsides, and every day she delayed was a day of abundance lost to rot and waste. The shed was 24 feet long and 10 feet wide, with slatted walls that allowed air to circulate freely and a roof of cedar shakes that kept the rain off without trapping moisture inside. She installed wooden racks at 3 levels, each fitted with frames of cheesecloth stretched taut over pine borders. A small stone hearth at one end provided supplemental heat for the wet autumn days when the sun alone could not finish the work. The design came from her mother, who had learned it from her mother, who had carried the knowledge from Tennessee in her memory because it was too valuable to trust to paper. We're 3 generations of women preserving the bounty of summer against the hunger of winter, and Lenora was the inheritor of their accumulated wisdom. She built her cabin second, a modest structure with 1 room, a sleeping loft, a fieldstone hearth, and a covered porch where she could sit in the evenings and watch the valley below. Copper got a lean-to stable attached to the cabin's north wall, snug and dry. The total cost of land, shed, and cabin came to $74, leaving her with $126 to see her through the first winter. She began harvesting that first autumn, working from dawn until dark. The wild plums grew thick in the creek bottoms, their purple-black fruit hanging heavy on branches that bent toward the ground. She filled baskets that Copper hauled up the hill on a wooden sledge, sorting the fruit by ripeness, cutting away the bruised portions, halving and pitting each plum before laying them cut side up on the drying frames. The huckleberries carpeted the high meadows in waves of blue-gray, so abundant that she could fill a bucket without moving more than 10 feet. She dried them slowly at the lowest possible temperature, watching carefully for the moment when they rattled like tiny stones, but still held their shape and color. The abandoned orchards were the greatest treasure. Apple trees planted by the first settlers, neglected for years, their fruit falling ungathered to rot on the ground. Lenora collected the sound apples from the branches and the best of the fallen ones, coring and peeling and slicing them to quarter-inch thickness, dipping them briefly in salted water to prevent browning, and laying them on her frames with the precision of a jeweler setting stones. The first batch of dried apple rings was ready by late October. 40 pounds of fruit that had cost her nothing but labor, transformed into food that would last for years if stored properly. She brought a sample to Elkridge, intending to offer it for sale. The general store was run by a woman named Opal Suttner, a stout figure with iron gray hair pulled back severely from a face that seemed designed for disapproval. Opal had positioned herself as the sole supplier of goods to Elkridge, controlling the flow of everything from flour to fabric, setting prices as she pleased, extending credit to those she favored, and denying it to those she did not. She examined Lenora's apple rings with theatrical disdain, holding one up to the light, sniffing it, bending it between her thick fingers as though testing for defects that only she could perceive. "Dried fruit," Opal said flatly. "You want me to sell dried fruit?" "I want to sell it myself," Lenora corrected. "I was hoping to set up a table outside your store on market days." Opal's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Hartwell, I stock everything this town needs, including dried fruit when the supply train brings it from Portland. Proper dried fruit, processed by proper companies in proper packaging. What you have here is homemade. People want what they know. They want labels and brands, not something cooked up in a shed by a widow with time on her hands." "It is not cooked," Lenora said mildly. "It is dried. There is a considerable difference." "The answer is no, Mrs. Hartwell. You may not set up outside my store. It would give the wrong impression." Lenora nodded. Washra took back her sample and left without argument. She had learned long ago that some battles were not worth fighting, and this was one of them. Opal Suttner's opinion did not change the quality of the fruit or the soundness of the method. It merely meant that Lenora would have to find another way. But the wrong impression spread through Elkridge like smoke through a valley. Samuel Thornton owned the lumber mill that employed half the town's working men. He was a prosperous figure with a booming voice and a laugh that carried across the saloon where he held court most evenings. When he heard about the widow on the hill and her shed full of drying fruit, he found the whole thing hilarious. 500 pounds of dried fruit, he announced to the assembled loggers and miners. The woman is building a monument to prunes. Perhaps she means to open a shop, Thornton's Dried Goods, specializing in madness by the pound. The laughter echoed through the saloon and out into the street and up the hill to where Lenora sat on her porch, watching the lights of Elkridge flicker in the valley below. She heard the laughter. She understood what it meant, and she continued her work the next morning as though nothing had happened. Samuel's wife, Constance, was more subtle in her disapproval, but no less effective. She organized a meeting of the women's auxiliary at the church to discuss the newcomer on the hill, and the consensus that emerged from that meeting would shape the town's attitude toward Lenora for years to come. "The woman is clearly affected by her husband's death," Constance announced to her circle. "Drying fruit by the hundreds of pounds borders on mania. And the conditions in that shed are hardly sanitary. Birds and insects have free access. No respectable woman would purchase food prepared in such an environment." "She means well, I am sure," Constance added with the particular tone of voice that indicated she was sure of nothing of the kind. "But the poor creature has lost her grip on reality. We must pray for her recovery and hope she does not contaminate the town's food supply in the meantime." The shed acquired a name after that meeting, the Madhouse. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button right now. It takes just a second, and it helps this video reach more people who need to hear it. The name spread through Elkridge with the speed of all small-town cruelty, were repeated in the saloon, in the general store, and the church steps until it became the accepted term for Lenora's operation. Children were warned to stay away from the madhouse. Wives cautioned husbands against accepting anything from the mad widow. Lenora Hartwell became a figure of pity and amusement, a cautionary tale about what happened to women who lost their husbands and their minds in the same season. Only one person in Elkridge disagreed with the consensus. Eudora Pruitt was 68 years old, a widow herself for more than a decade. living alone in a small cabin on the edge of town. She had outlived her husband, her children, and most of her friends, and she had long since stopped caring what the respectable citizens of Elkridge thought about anything. She climbed the hill to Lenora's cabin one autumn afternoon, moving slowly but steadily up the steep path, and knocked on the door with the determined expression of someone who had made a decision and intended to see it through. "I heard what they are calling your shed," Eudora said when Lenora opened the door, "and I came to tell you that they called my mother's shed the same thing, back in Tennessee, when she was preserving food while the neighbors were laughing. Then the war came, and the neighbors stopped laughing, and my mother fed half the county for 2 winters on what she had stored away." She paused, studying Lenora with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "May I see it? Your madhouse?" Lenora led her to the drying shed and opened the door. The shelves were already filling with the autumn harvest, cloth sacks and sealed wooden boxes labeled by type and date, with each one representing hours of careful work, transforming perishable abundance into lasting sustenance. Eudora walked the length of the shed, examining everything with the practiced eye of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. "Your mother taught you," she said. It was not a question. "And her mother before her," Lenora confirmed. Eudora nodded. "The knowledge passes from hand to hand," she said quietly, "like a flame that must never be allowed to go out." She turned to face Lenora. "They will mock you until they need you. That is the way of people who do not understand preparation. When the crisis comes, they will line up outside your door and pretend they never laughed." Lenora smiled, the first genuine smile she had shared with anyone since arriving in Elkridge. "I know," she said, "but I am not doing this for their approval. I am doing it because good food should not rot on the ground while people go hungry, and no one else seems to care." Eudora laughed, a dry sound like leaves rustling in autumn wind. "Good," she said. "Do not let them change you. And if you ever need someone to help with the harvest, I may be old, but my hands still work." From that day forward, Eudora Pruitt was a regular visitor to the hillside. She came when she could, helping with the sorting and slicing and laying out of fruit, sharing stories of Tennessee and the old ways, and the women who had preserved knowledge through harder times than these. She was the only friend Lenora had in Elkridge, and that friendship sustained her through the years of mockery that followed. One other person showed her kindness, though it did not last. Virgil Brennan was 35 years old. A miner who worked the small silver operation on the north side of the valley. He was a quiet man with hands roughened by rock work and eyes that held more intelligence than his rough appearance suggested. When he saw Lenora being turned away from Opal's store that first autumn, something in him had objected to the unfairness of it. He found her loading her sample back into her wagon and approached with the awkward determination of a man unused to speaking to women outside the saloon. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "the dried fruit you showed Mrs. Sutner. I would buy some if you are willing to sell." Lenora looked at him carefully. She had learned to read people during her years in the Willamette Valley, and what she read in Virgil Brennan was genuine interest, not mockery disguised as friendship. "I have 40 pounds ready," she said. I can spare 5 if you have use for them." The transaction was simple. Virgil paid 50 cents for 5 pounds of dried apple rings, a fair price that acknowledged the quality of the work without taking advantage of her isolation. He helped her load the rest into her wagon without being asked. And when Samuel Thornton made his joke about Thornton's dried goods at the saloon that evening, Virgil did not laugh with the others. His silence was noticed. A few weeks later, Virgil was unloading supplies from his mule outside Opal's store when Constance Thornton emerged with her arms full of packages. She saw Lenora approaching from the opposite direction and loudly announced to no one in particular that she hoped the mad widow would not contaminate the air with her presence. "Mrs. Hartwell is no madder than anyone else in this town," Virgil said quietly. "Considerably less mad than some, if you ask me." Constance stiffened. "I did not ask you, Mr. Brennan. and I would advise you to consider whose side you wish to take in this matter." "I was not aware there were sides," Virgil replied. "I thought there was just a woman trying to make her way after losing her husband, same as my mother did when my father died in the mines." Constance had no response to that. She swept away with her packages clutched to her chest like armor. But the damage was done. Word spread through Elkridge that Virgil Brennan had defended the Mad Widow, and the speculation about what that might mean was even more entertaining to the gossips than the widow herself. For a brief moment, Lenore allowed herself to hope. Here was someone who saw through the mockery, who recognized the value in what she was doing, who might become an ally in a town that had decided to treat her as a pariah. That hope lasted until the following spring. If you have ever had someone defend you in public only to abandon you later, you know how much that betrayal stings. Tell us in the comments if you have experienced something similar. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time, because what happens next will test Lenora in ways she never imagined. The silver mine where Virgil worked was owned by a consortium that included Samuel Thornton as a minority partner. When word reached Samuel that one of his miners had publicly contradicted his wife, he made his displeasure known in the way that wealthy men always do, not through direct confrontation, but through the quiet application of economic pressure. Virgil found himself assigned to the worst shifts. His pay was docked for minor infractions that had previously been overlooked. The other miners, sensing which way the wind was blowing, began to avoid him during meals and after work. 3 months after defending Lenora outside Opal's store, Virgil Brennan stood in the saloon with Samuel Thornton's hand on his shoulder and a choice to make between his livelihood and his conscience. He chose his livelihood. "I spoke out of turn," Virgil announced to the assembled drinkers. "Mrs. Hartwell's affairs are none of my concern. A man has to focus on his own business, not go defending every widow who cannot adapt to her circumstances." Samuel Thornton smiled and bought Virgil a drink, and the matter was considered settled. But Virgil could not meet Lenora's eyes the next time he saw her in town. And he crossed to the other side of the street, his work-roughened fingers shoved deep in his pockets, his jaw set with the particular rigidity of a man who knows he has done something shameful and cannot figure out how to undo it. Lenora watched him cross. She understood the economics of what had happened, the way small towns could crush anyone who stood against the consensus. She did not hate Virgil for his weakness, but she did add his betrayal to the ledger she kept in her heart, the account of kindnesses offered and withdrawn that would one day come due. The years passed. 1886, 1887, 1888. 3 autumns of harvest and 3 winters of isolation. Lenore expanded her operation methodically, planting apple and pear saplings that would not bear for years, but represented an investment in a future she intended to claim. She cultivated blackberry canes along her fence line. She established relationships with 2 families who lived higher in the valley, trading finished dried fruit for access to their huckleberry patches. Her methods grew more sophisticated with each season. She discovered that plums dried at a slightly lower heat for a longer period produced prunes of superior texture. She learned that cherries dried over the stone hearth on rainy days retained more color than those dried in full sun. She developed a method for pressing dried berries into dense cakes that weighed almost nothing but packed extraordinary nourishment. The storage cellar she dug into the hillside behind her cabin filled slowly but steadily. Cedar-lined to repel insects and moisture, cool and dark even in summer, it held the accumulated wealth of 3 years of patient labor. Cloth sacks inside sealed wooden boxes, each one labeled with contents and date, each one representing food that could sustain life when all other sources failed. By the autumn of 1888, her ledger showed a reserve of 512 pounds. It was an extraordinary quantity, more than 1 woman and 1 horse could eat in 5 years, more than any reasonable assessment of personal need could justify. The people of Elkridge, who had been mocking her for 3 years, pointed to this surplus as final proof of her mental deterioration. 500 pounds of dried fruit, Opal Sutner reported at her store, shaking her head in wonderment. The woman has lost her mind entirely. Who needs 500 pounds of fruit? Samuel Thornton laughed until tears ran down his cheeks. She will be buried in prunes before she is buried in the ground. He wheezed. Someone should write to the territorial asylum and have her committed before she drowns the whole valley in dried apples. Even Constance Thornton, who had refined her disapproval into an art form over the years, seemed almost sympathetic. The poor creature, she sighed at her weekly circle. 3 years of labor for nothing but a cellar full of fruit that will never be eaten. One almost pities her. Lenora heard all of it. The mockery drifted up the hill like smoke, impossible to ignore, equally impossible to take seriously. She added another 20 pounds of dried pear to her stores and said nothing. The autumn of 1888 was wet. The rains came early and stayed late, saturating the mountain passes, weakening the rail beds, turning the crude roads into rivers of mud. Lenora watched the clouds gathering over the Cascades and remembered her mother's words from decades ago. When the clouds gather low for 3 days running, the winter will be hard. When they stay for a week, the winter will be cruel. When they do not lift at all through autumn, the winter will kill. The clouds did not lift through the autumn of 1888. The supply train that arrived on November 15th would be the last. No one knew this at the time. The railroad had not announced any disruption. The schedules posted at the depot showed trains arriving every 2 weeks through the winter, as they always had. But the schedules were printed in Portland by men who had never seen a Cascade winter, and the winter of 1888 to 1889 would make liars of them all. Lenora stood on her porch that November evening, watching the lights of Elkridge flicker in the valley below, and felt the weight of what was coming settle onto her shoulders like a physical burden. She walked to her storage cellar and opened the door. 512 pounds of dried fruit gleamed in the lamplight, organized by type and date. 3 years of labor made manifest in food that would not spoil. Well, she said quietly to herself, I suppose they will be coming round soon. She closed the door and went inside to prepare for winter. The first missed train caused little concern. Delays were common in winter, snow on the tracks, equipment failures, the 1,000 small disasters that plagued transportation in the mountain territories. The people of Elkridge grumbled about the inconvenience, but assumed the next train would arrive on schedule with double the usual cargo to make up for the delay. The second missed train produced unease. December 17th came and went with no whistle from the valley, no plume of steam rising above the trees, no loaded cars pulling into the depot with flour and coffee, and all the other necessities that Elkridge could not produce for itself. The station master sent a telegram to Portland asking about the delay and received no response. The telegraph lines, he explained to anyone who asked, must have been damaged by the storms. The third missed train, the one that should have arrived on December 31st, carrying not only general supplies but the special holiday provisions that families had ordered weeks in advance, watched produce something closer to alarm. Children had been promised oranges for Christmas. Women had been counting on new fabric for winter dresses. Men had been expecting ammunition for the hunting that supplemented their families' diets. Instead, they received silence from the railroad and growing fear in their hearts. By mid-January, the alarm had become dread. The passes were closed. This information came not from the railroad, which had stopped communicating entirely, but from a trapper who had tried to cross on foot and nearly died in the attempt. 30 feet of snow in the Cascade passes, he reported, and more falling every day. The locomotives that were supposed to clear the tracks sat frozen on sidings 100 miles to the west, as useless as the promises of politicians who had never spent a winter above 3,000 feet. Mana Elkridge had 260 souls, a general store with rapidly emptying shelves, and a growing understanding that the civilization they had trusted to sustain them had simply stopped. Opal Sutner's store, which had entered the winter modestly stocked, began to run dry. The flour went first, always the flour, because it was the foundation of every frontier kitchen. The women of Elkridge could stretch meat and vegetables, and even sugar if they had to, but without flour there could be no bread, no biscuits, no dumplings, no gravy, no pie crust, no hundred other things that transformed raw ingredients into meals. Then the sugar went, and the coffee, which the loggers and mill workers depended upon the way a preacher depends upon scripture. Then the salt pork and the tinned goods and the dried beans, until the shelves that had once groaned with abundance stood as bare and accusing as a guilty conscience. Opal rationed what remained. She raised her prices, not gradually but brutally, the way a person raises a weapon when they feel threatened. Flour went from $2 a sack to 5, then 8, then 12. Families who had been living comfortably discovered that comfortable was a temporary condition, entirely dependent on a supply chain that had snapped like a rotten rope. The hunger set in during February. Not the dramatic starvation of a besieged city, but the slow grinding deprivation of a community that was simply running out. Meals shrank from 3 to 2 to 1. Mothers fed their children and ate nothing themselves. And fathers sat at empty tables with clenched jaws and hollow eyes, unable to provide what their families needed, no matter how hard they worked or how much they wanted to. The elderly, as they so often did, suffered in silence. They had lived through hard times before. They understood the mathematics of scarcity, the way resources had to be concentrated on those who had the most years ahead of them. They ate less so the children could eat more, and they did not complain, and they grew weaker day by day while pretending that everything was fine. If you have ever known hunger, real hunger, not the discomfort of missing a meal, but the deep ache of a body consuming itself, you understand what Elkridge endured that February. If you have ever watched someone you love grow thin while you stood helpless, will you understand the particular despair that settled over the town like a second winter? Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a time when everything you depended on simply stopped working? Eudora Pruitt died on February 3rd. Lenora found her the next morning, having climbed down from the hill to check on her only friend, when Eudora failed to appear for their weekly visit. The cabin door was unlocked. The interior was warm, the fire in the hearth having burned down to coals overnight, but not yet gone cold. The woodpile outside was full, carefully stacked, sufficient to last another month at least. But the cupboards were empty. The root cellar beneath the floor held nothing but dust. And Eudora lay in her bed with a peaceful expression on her face, as though she had simply decided to stop. She had died warm but hungry. She had died with fuel enough to survive the winter, but no food to make survival worthwhile. She had died alone because she was too proud to ask for help and too old to fight for her share of what little the town had left. Lenora closed her friend's eyes and sat beside the bed for a long time, holding the cold hand that had helped her sort fruit through 3 autumns. Eudora had believed in her when no one else would. Eudora had shared stories of Tennessee and the old ways and the women who preserved knowledge through hard times. Eudora had been the only person in Elkridge who understood what Lenora was building on the hillside, and now she was gone. "I should have checked sooner," Lenora whispered. "I should have brought food." But she knew, even as she said it, for that Eudora would never have accepted charity. The old woman's pride had been as strong as her constitution, and both had failed her in the end. Lenora buried her friend on the hillside, in a spot where the morning sun struck first and lingered longest. She dug the frozen ground herself, working through the day and into the evening, And she did not weep until the last shovelful of earth covered the plain wooden coffin she had built from scrap lumber. Then she wept. She wept for Eudora and for Silas and for her mother Maud, who had died years ago in the valley, and for all the women whose knowledge she carried and whose faith she was struggling to justify. She wept until the tears froze on her cheeks, and the stars wheeled overhead, and Copper stamped nervously in the stable, sensing her distress. When the weeping was done, she made a vow. No one else would die of hunger in Elkridge while she had food to share. Not the people who had mocked her, not the women who had called her mad, not even Opal Sutner or Samuel Thornton or Constance with her weekly circle of disapproval. Lenora would feed them all, and she would do it not for gratitude or vindication, but because letting people starve when she had the means to sustain them was the greatest waste of all. She walked back to her cabin through the frozen darkness, her heart heavier than it had been since Silas died, her purpose clearer than it had ever been in her life. The second death came 8 days later. The Sullivan family lived on the far edge of Elkridge, in a cabin even smaller and more isolated than Eudora's had been. Patrick Sullivan was Irish, which in Elkridge meant he was treated with the same casual contempt that the town reserved for the mad widow on the hill. His wife Mary had given birth to their third child in December, a daughter they named Bridget after Patrick's mother, who had died during the crossing from Ireland 30 years before. Bridget Sullivan lived for 8 weeks. She died on February 11, in the darkest hours of the night, while her mother sang to her in a voice that cracked with exhaustion and grief. The song was about a land where the apple trees never stopped bearing and the rivers ran sweet with cream. It was a song Mary's mother had sung to her, and her mother before that, passed down through generations of Irish women who had known hunger and survived it and dreamed of a place where no one would ever be hungry again. Bridget did not live to see that place. Declan Sullivan was 8 years old enough to understand what had happened to his baby sister, old enough to feel the particular helplessness of a child who cannot save the people he loves. He stood in the corner of the cabin while his mother's song faded into silence and his father's shoulders shook with sobs he was trying to hide. His mother looked up. Her eyes were dry now, emptied of tears by weeks of crying. She spoke to Declan in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "The widow on the hill," she said. "Mrs. Hartwell. I heard she has food. Go to her, Declan. Tell her what has happened. Ask if she has anything to spare for your brother and sister." Declan pulled on his coat and his boots and his father's hat, which was too big for him but warmer than his own. He slipped out the door and into the frozen night, his breath making clouds in the air, his small feet finding the path that led up the hill through snow that came past his knees in places. He knocked on Lenora's door just before dawn. She opened it to find a boy with a face too thin and eyes too old, standing on her porch with snow crusting his shoulders and a message he could barely get out between chattering teeth. "My sister died," he said. "My baby sister Bridget. Mama said you have apples." Lenora brought him inside and wrapped him in blankets and fed him warm broth and dried fruit softened in hot water. She listened while he told her about his family, about his father who could not find work because no one would hire an Irishman, about his mother who had not eaten in days so her children could have more, and about his baby sister who had been born too small and had never gotten bigger. When he finished, Lenora made her decision. "Stay here," she told him. "Warm yourself. Eat what you need. I will bring food to your family, and then I will bring food to everyone else." She loaded Copper's sledge with 100 pounds of dried fruit, apples and pears, and plums and cherries and berry cakes, everything she had spent 3 years accumulating. She drove down the hill in the gray light of dawn, with Declan riding beside her, and she did not stop at the Sullivan cabin. She went to the center of Elkridge, to the empty space in front of Opal Sutner's store, the same spot where she had been refused permission to sell her fruit 3 years before. She set up a makeshift table of planks and sawhorses. She arranged her goods where everyone could see them, and then she waited. The first person to approach was not a customer, but a witness. Opal Suttner emerged from her store with a shawl wrapped tight against the cold and an expression that combined disbelief with something that might have been recognition. She had spent 3 years telling everyone that Lenora Hartwell was mad, that her dried fruit was contaminated, that no respectable person should have anything to do with the madhouse on the hill. Now her shelves were empty and Lenora's were full, and the irony was not lost on either of them. "Mrs. Hartwell," Opal said, "what do you think you are doing?" "Feeding people," Lenora replied. "There is no charge. Take what you need." Opal stared at her. "No charge?" "No charge," Lenora confirmed. "The fruit is free. The knowledge of how to use it is free. Everything I have is available to anyone who is hungry, which appears to be everyone." She paused. "Including you, Mrs. Suttner, if you have need." Opal opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. For once in her life, she had nothing to say. The words spread through Elkridge with the speed of desperation. The mad widow had food. The woman with the madhouse on the hill, the one they had been laughing at for 3 years, had what Opal's store did not, what the railroad could not deliver, what money could not buy. They came in a steady stream. Mothers with children balanced on their hips. Loggers with the shame of hungry men on their weathered faces. The elderly supported by younger arms, moving slowly through the cold toward a table piled with sweetness. Lenora distributed her stores with calm efficiency, measuring portions by family size, while ensuring that each household received enough to last a week. She showed them how to reconstitute the dried fruit in warm water, how to simmer it into a thick compote that stretched further and satisfied longer than eating it dry. She demonstrated her berry cakes, explaining that a single cake the size of a man's palm contained enough nourishment for a day's labor. She did not mention the years of mockery. She did not point out that the same people now accepting her charity had called her mad and unclean and pitiful. She simply did the work hour after hour, day after day, because that was what the women of her family had always done. If you are watching this and you have ever helped someone who treated you badly, you understand Lenora's choice. Hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments. What gave you the strength to rise above the way others treated you? She returned the next day with another 100 pounds, and the next, and the next. For 35 days, Lenora Hartwell fed Elkridge. She rose before dawn each morning, loaded her sledge, drove copper down the frozen hill, and distributed her harvest to whoever came. She supplemented the fruit with whatever else she had. Dried venison from the hill families who had traded with her, potatoes from her root cellar, eggs from her 3 chickens that had continued laying throughout the winter in their snug coop beside the cabin. The dried fruit proved more sustaining than anyone had expected. It was dense with sugar and fiber and the concentrated essence of summer, and bodies that had been failing began to recover. Children who ate it regained their color within days. The adults who had grown listless and weak found their strength returning. The berry cakes in particular became a revelation, keeping the mill workers on their feet when nothing else could. Constance Thornton was seen one morning in the line, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground, accepting a bag of dried pears from the woman she had called mad and wholesome and pitiful. Her husband Samuel, whose laughter about Thornton's dried goods had echoed through the saloon, lay bedridden in their home with the weakness that came from weeks of inadequate nutrition. The mill had closed in January. There was no work, no income, no way to buy food even if food had been available. Constance took the pears without speaking. Lenora gave them without comment. Some transactions required no words. Virgil Brennan came on the 5th day. He stood at the back of the line, his calloused palms shoved deep in his pockets, his jaw set with the rigidity of a man who knows he is about to do something humiliating but cannot figure out how to avoid it. He had not spoken to Lenora since his public repudiation 3 years before, had crossed the street to avoid her, had pretended she did not exist because acknowledging her meant acknowledging his own cowardice. Now he was hungry, and his wife was hungry, and his 2 children were hungry, and the woman he had betrayed was the only person in Elkridge with food to spare. Lenora watched him approach. She recognized the shame in his posture, the way his eyes refused to meet hers, the particular misery of a proud man reduced to begging from someone he had wronged. She could have made him suffer. She could have reminded him of his words in the saloon, his declaration that her affairs were none of his concern, his choice to save his job at the cost of his integrity. She could have refused him entirely, letting his family's hunger serve as punishment for his betrayal. She filled a bag with dried apples and pears and cherries and handed it to him. Virgil looked at the bag, then at her. His throat worked, but no words came out. "Your wife needs to eat," Lenora said quietly. "Your children need to eat. Shame does not nourish anyone. Take the food, Mr. Brennan. Use it well." Virgil took the bag. His hands were trembling. "Mrs. Hartwell," he managed. I should not have." "There will be time for words later," Lenora said gently. "Right now there is only time for survival. Go home to your family." Virgil went. But he looked back twice before he disappeared around the corner, and the expression on his face was not just gratitude, but something closer to wonder, as though he was seeing Lenora clearly for the first time. The supply train finally arrived on March 9th, 1889, 96 days after the last delivery. The locomotive came through the pass, trailing steam and triumph, its cars loaded with flour and coffee and everything else that Elkridge had been denied. The town greeted it with relief that bordered on hysteria, people laughing and crying and embracing strangers in the street, as though the train's arrival had personally saved their lives, which for many of them it had not. Lenora Hartwell had saved their lives. The mad widow with her madhouse on the hill. The woman they had mocked for 3 years, though had done what the railroad could not and the store would not. She had stood between Elkridge and starvation with nothing but dried fruit and the knowledge of how to use it. A reckoning was coming. Everyone knew it. The question was what form it would take. The gathering was called for the Sunday following the train's arrival. It was held in the church because the church was the largest building in Elkridge, and because the occasion seemed to demand the gravity of sacred ground. Every surviving resident attended. They filled the pews and lined the walls and spilled out onto the steps. And the hush that preceded the first speaker was the hush of people who knew they were about to witness something that would define their community for generations. Opal Sutner asked to speak first. She walked to the front of the assembly with the heavy steps of a woman approaching a confession she had been rehearsing for weeks. Her iron gray hair was as severe as ever, but something in her face had changed. The habitual disapproval had been replaced by an expression that was harder to read, something that mixed shame with reluctant admiration. 3 years ago, Opal began, her voice stripped of its usual certainty. A woman came to my store with a sample of dried fruit and asked to sell it from a table outside my door. I refused her. I told her that people wanted proper goods from proper companies. I told her that homemade fruit from a hillside shed was beneath the standards of my establishment. She paused. Her hands gripped the pulpit rail as though it was the only thing keeping her upright. "My establishment has been empty for 3 months," she continued. "My shelves have held nothing but dust and shame. And the woman I refuse, the woman this town called mad, called eccentric, called the widow with the madhouse, that woman fed your families when I could not." She turned to face Lenora, who sat near the back of the church in the same spot she always occupied, neither hiding nor seeking attention. "Mrs. Hartwell, I was wrong about your fruit, about your methods, about everything. I am a merchant who had nothing to sell. You were a woman who had everything to give. I do not deserve your forgiveness. but I asked for it nonetheless. The church was utterly still. Opal's confession had named what everyone was feeling, the recognition that they had misjudged someone catastrophically and been saved by her anyway. Constance Thornton rose next. Her husband Samuel was still too weak to attend, so she spoke for both of them. My husband made jokes about Mrs. Hartwell's dried fruit, Constance said quietly. He laughed until he cried at the idea of 500 pounds of prunes. I organized a meeting of the Women's Auxiliary to discuss the conditions in her drying shed, and we concluded that her operation was unsanitary and her mind was unbalanced. Her voice broke. I ate Mrs. Hartwell's pears last month and wept because they tasted like summer, and I had forgotten what summer tasted like. I fed them to my husband and watched the color return to his face. The woman I called mad saved my family's lives. She sat down without asking for forgiveness. Perhaps she felt she had no right to ask. Others spoke, the mothers who had fed their children, and the loggers whose strength had been sustained, the elderly who had survived because a woman they never spoke to had thought of them anyway. Each confession was a variation on the same theme, shame at past cruelty transformed into gratitude for present salvation. Then Virgil Brennan stood. He walked to the front of the church with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided to tell the whole truth regardless of the consequences. His weathered hands hung at his sides. His eyes, for the first time in 3 years, met Lenora's directly. 3 years ago, he said, I defended Mrs. Hartwell in public. I told Constance Thornton that she was no madder than anyone else in this town. And then I let Samuel Thornton threaten my job. And I took back my words and I announced in the saloon that Mrs. Hartwell's affairs were none of my concern. He swallowed hard. I was a coward. I chose my paycheck over my principles. I watched a good woman be mocked and slandered, and I did nothing to stop it because stopping it would have cost me something. His voice strengthened. Last week, Mrs. Hartwell gave me food for my family. She had every reason to refuse. She had every reason to remind me of my betrayal. Instead, she told me that shame does not nourish anyone, and she sent me home with more dried fruit than I deserved. He turned to face Lenora directly. Mrs. Hartwell, I cannot undo what I did, but I can try to make it right. If you will teach this town how to dry fruit, how to preserve the abundance of summer against the hunger of winter, I will help build the sheds. I will do whatever labor is required, not for pay, but for penance. It is the least I can offer. No one moved. Virgil's confession had gone beyond simple apology into something more difficult, a promise of action rather than just words. Lenora Hartwell stood. She moved with the deliberate calm of someone who had made her decision and would not be rushed. She walked to the front of the church without hurrying, and when she turned to face the congregation, her expression held no triumph, no bitterness, no vindication. It held only calm. My mother taught me to dry fruit, she said simply. Her mother taught her. It was not cleverness or prophecy that filled my shed. It was habit. The habit of women who understood that summer does not last, that trains do not always run, that the only provision you can truly depend upon is the one you make with your own hands. She looked around the church. We meeting eyes that 3 months ago would have looked away in embarrassment or contempt. I did not dry 500 pounds of fruit to prove a point. I dried it because waste offends me. Every autumn, fruit falls from the trees around this town and rots on the ground. Perfectly good food left to the worms and the weather. While this community trusts its survival to a railroad schedule printed in Portland by men who have never spent a winter here. Her voice softened, but lost none of its clarity. I am not angry with any of you. Mockery is the sound people make when they do not understand something. Now you understand. And if you wish to learn, I will teach you. She paused. The fruit is there for the taking. The sun is free. The knowledge is simple. No family in this valley need ever go hungry again if they are willing to do the work. way she sat down. The quiet that followed was not the quiet of shame, but the quiet of people absorbing a truth they had not expected to hear. Lenora had not demanded apologies, had not listed grievances, had not made anyone grovel for her forgiveness. She had simply offered to share what she knew, to transform the mockery of 3 years into the foundation of something lasting. If you know someone who responded to cruelty with grace, share this video with them. Hit that like button and tell us in the comments what lesson from this story will stay with you. The summer of 1889 saw 11 drying sheds rise on the hillsides around Elkridge. Each one was built under Lenora's patient instruction, following the design her mother had taught her, which her grandmother had brought from Tennessee. She showed the women, and more than a few of the men, how to select fruit at its peak ripeness, how to prepare it for drying, how to regulate heat and airflow, how to store the finished product for years if necessary. The knowledge passed from hand to hand, exactly as Eudora Pruitt had promised it would, spreading through Elkridge like warmth returning after a long winter. Virgil Brennan kept his promise. He spent the summer building and hauling and learning, his calloused hands proving as capable with saw and hammer as they had been with pick and shovel. He built Lenora's supply sledge a new set of runners, and when she protested that he had done enough, he simply shook his head and kept working. "It is not enough," he said quietly. "It will never be enough. But it is something." Opal Sutner added a dried fruit section to her store, stocked exclusively with locally produced goods. She displayed them prominently with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Elkridge's Finest, prepared by our own." She charged a fair price and paid her suppliers fairly in return. "It is the most honest business I have ever conducted," she admitted to Lenora one afternoon. "I spent years convincing people they needed what I could sell them. I never considered that they might be better off producing it themselves." Constance Thornton became one of Lenora's most devoted students, the woman who had organized the meeting, calling Lenora's operation unsanitary, and her mind unbalanced, now spent autumn afternoons on Lenora's porch, slicing pears and learning the techniques that 3 generations of women had refined. By the second year, Constance's dried pears were as good as Lenora's own. "I never understood," Constance said one evening, "watching the valley fill with the gold of turning leaves. I thought preparation was what poor people did because they could not afford to buy things properly. I did not realize it was wisdom. I did not realize it was strength." Lenora smiled. "Your grandmother probably knew," she said. "Somewhere back in your family, there was a woman who understood. The knowledge gets lost sometimes when times are easy, but it can always be found again." The phrase "filling the shed" became common wisdom in Elkridge. It meant preparing for hardship during times of ease, preserving today's abundance against tomorrow's scarcity. Parents taught it to children. Neighbors reminded each other of it when summer fruit began to ripen. It was spoken with quiet conviction, as if the speaker had learned its meaning through experience that left no room for doubt. Which, of course, they had. The Sullivan family never forgot what Lenora had done for them. Patrick found work eventually, when the prejudice against the Irish faded enough for employers to recognize his skill and reliability. Mary bore 2 more children, both of whom grew strong and healthy, and she taught them the songs her mother had taught her, including the one about the land where the apple trees never stopped bearing. Declan Sullivan, the boy who had knocked on Lenora's door in the darkest hour of the famine, grew into a young man with his father's strength and his mother's gentleness. He visited Lenora every week without fail, helping with the harvest, learning the techniques, listening to the stories of Tennessee, and the women who had preserved knowledge through harder times. On the day Lenora died, in the spring of 1916, Declan was at her bedside. She was 74 years old. She had lived on her hillside for 31 years, drying fruit until her hands could no longer hold the knife. She had taught hundreds of people the skills her mother had taught her. She had transformed a town that mocked her into a community that would never again depend entirely on the railroad for its survival. "The shed," she whispered to Declan, her voice fading, but her eyes still clear. "Take care of the shed." "I will," he promised. "I will make sure it stands as long as it is needed." She smiled. "That is enough," she said. "That is all anyone can ask." She closed her eyes and the breath went out of her, and Lenora Hartwell was gone. They buried her beside Silas on the hillside, in a spot where the morning sun struck first and lingered longest. Copper had preceded her by a decade. It buried near the drying shed, where the mare had waited so many patient mornings while her mistress loaded the sledge. The graves were marked with simple stones, and wildflowers grew around them in summer, and the fruit trees Lenora had planted decades ago cast dappled shade across the resting place of a woman who had understood that summer does not last. The drying shed still stands. The cedar shakes have been replaced 3 times. The racks have been rebuilt twice. The cheesecloth screens have been renewed every few years as the old ones wore through. But the structure is Lenora's, and the families who maintain it follow her methods precisely. Each autumn, when the fruit comes ripe, when women gather there to continue the work that a widow began with nothing but grief and knowledge, and the stubborn conviction that abundance should never be wasted. They work the way Lenora taught them, the way her mother taught her, the way generations of women have always worked when summer's bounty threatens to slip away. The methods have not changed. The knowledge has not been lost. And every jar of preserved fruit, every carefully labeled box in every cedar-lined cellar carries forward the legacy of a woman who refused to let anything go to waste. Above the door, carved by hands that knew more about fruit than about carpentry, is an inscription that Lenora placed there in 1890, the year after the famine. Summer forgets, the shed remembers. Her mother Maud, who had carried the knowledge from Tennessee, she would have recognized every word. Her grandmother, whose name was spoken with reverence in the hill country, would have understood exactly what those 5 words meant. They meant that time moves forward, but wisdom moves in circles. They meant that the skills we inherit from our mothers are more valuable than money. They meant that the women who prepare are the women who survive, and the communities that listen to them are the communities that thrive. They meant that Lenora Hartwell, the mad widow with her madhouse on the hill, had known something that Elkridge had forgotten and would never forget again. The trains run on schedule now. The stores are fully stocked. The passes rarely close for more than a few days at a time. The kind of isolation that nearly killed Elkridge in the winter of 1889 has become almost impossible in the modern world of highways and airplanes and supply chains that span the globe. But the drying sheds still stand on the hillsides around Elkridge, and every autumn, when the fruit comes ripe, the descendants of those who mocked Lenora Hartwell gather to honor her memory by continuing her work. Stories are how we remember, and this story matters because somewhere, right now, a woman is being called paranoid for filling her pantry, eccentric for learning old skills, mad for preparing when everyone else is laughing. She needs to know that the wisdom of generations is worth more than the approval of neighbors. She needs to know that summer forgets, but the shed remembers, and so do we. Thank you for watching this story about Lenora Hartwell in the drying shed of Elkridge. In times of plenty, preparation looks like paranoia. In times of scarcity, it looks like prophecy. If this story reminded you that the old ways exist for a reason, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of quiet strength and hard-won wisdom. And tell us in the comments, has anyone ever called your preparations unnecessary until the day they were not? The answer for most of us is yes. The answer for Lenora Hartwell was an entire town. And in the end, every single one of them understood.